The morning sun cast long shadows the dusty plains of Montana Territory when Jake Morrison first laid eyes on the old would change his life. Jake had been tending to his cattle near Crow Creek when he spotted the figure collapsed beside the weathered cottonwood tree, barely breathing, his weathered hands clutching his chest in obvious. Most in these would have ridden past without a second glance. The year was 1876, and tensions between settlers and the native tribes ran higher than a summer thunderstorm. But Jake Morrison wasn't most folks. Something about the dignity in the old man's face, even in his weakened state, made Jake dismount his horse and approach with careful steps. The elder's eyes opened as Jake knelt beside him, and what Jake saw there wasn't the hostility he'd been taught to expect. Instead, he found wisdom, pain, and something else that took him a moment to recognize: hope. The old man spoke in broken English, his voice barely a whisper against the prairie wind. "Doctor, need doctor," he managed, his hand moving to a small leather pouch. "My people depend." Jake found him. He could ride away, tell himself it wasn't his concern, and continue with his quiet life, raising cattle on the edge of civilization. Or he could do what his grandmother back in Ohio had always taught him, that every soul deserved compassion, regardless of the color of their skin or the language he spoke. Without hesitation, Jake made a decision. He helped the elder onto his horse, supporting the frail man's weight as they began the 20-mile journey to Billings, where old Doc Henderson maintained his practice above the general's. But as they rode, Jake began to understand that this wasn't just any elder he was helping. The old man's name was White Eagle, and as his strength slowly returned during their careful journey, he began to share fragments of his story. He was a medicine, a keeper of ancient knowledge, and more importantly, he was the grandfather of Chief Running Bear, leader of one of the most respected bands in the nation. "My grandson," White Eagle explained as they paused to rest a stream, "he listens to the young warriors who speak of war, but I have seen enough seasons to know that some battles are won not with arrows, but with understanding." Jake learned that White Eagle had been traveling to a gathering of tribal leaders, hoping to counsel peace and find ways for his people to survive the changing times. The chest pains had struck him down just miles from his destination, and without help, he would never have made it to share his wisdom with those who desperately needed to hear it. As they continued toward Billings, Jake began to notice signs that they weren't traveling alone. Shadows moved in the distant hills, keeping pace with their progress. At first it made him nervous, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. But White Eagle noticed his tension and placed a calming hand on Jake's arm. "Over those they care about," explained with a gentle, "You show kindness to their grandfather, so now you are under their protection, too." The revelation sent a chill down Jake's spine from fear. He realized that every step of this journey was being observed, every act of kindness noted. The responsibility of what he'd undertaken began to settle on his shoulders like a heavy winter coat. Doc Henderson was initially reluctant to treat a native patient, but Jake's quiet insistence and the obvious severity of White Eagle's condition quickly overcame any hesitation. The doctor's examination revealed what Jake had suspected. The elder's heart was failing, weakened by age and the stress of his difficulty. "I can give him medicine that might help," Doc Henderson explained privately to Jake, "but at his age, his condition, well, let's just say you did right, bringing him here when you did." While White Eagle rested in the doctor's back room, Jake found himself pacing the wooden sidewalks of Billings, his mind racing with thoughts he'd never entertained before. He'd grown up hearing stories about savage attacks and brutal conflict, but the man he'd helped showed none of the characteristics he'd been taught to expect. Instead, White Eagle possessed a dignity and wisdom that reminded Jake of his own grandfather. That evening, as White Eagle's condition stabilized, the elder asked Jake to sit with him. The small room was lit only by a single oil lamp, casting dancing shadows on the walls as White Eagle shared stories of his youth, of the great buffalo herds that once covered the plains like a living carpet, and of the prophecies that spoke of a time when all peoples would need to learn to live together or face mutual destruction. "You are a bridge," White Eagle told Jake, his eyes ring the lamplight. "Your heart sees what many eyes cannot. This is why the spirits guided you to find me." Jake spent the night in a chair beside White Eagle's bed, listening to the elder's labored breathing and thinking about the choice. By morning, Doc Henderson declared that the medicine was working and White Eagle was strong enough to travel, though he would need to take The journey back to White Eagle's people took 3 days, with frequent stops to rest and allow the elder to regain his strength. During those long hours on the trail, Jake learned more about the Crow Nation than any white man in the territory. He heard about their traditions, their struggles to adapt to the shrinking buffalo herds, and their desperate attempts to find a path forward that would preserve their culture while ensuring their survival. But more importantly, Jake began to understand the significance of the man he was helping. White Eagle wasn't just any medicine. He was a revered elder whose counsel was sought by leaders throughout the region. His wisdom had prevented conflicts before, and his voice carried the weight of generations of accumulated knowledge. As they neared the Crow encampment, Jake noticed the number of shadowy figures in the distance had grown considerably. What had started as a few scouts keeping watch had multiplied into what appeared to be a substantial force, though they maintained their distance and showed no signs of hostility. White Eagle noticed Jake's growing awareness of their escort and chuckled softly. Word travels fast among my. They know their grandfather returns, and they know who helped him return. The entrance to the Crow encampment was unlike anything Jake had expected. Instead of being met with suspicion or hostility, he found himself surrounded by curious but respectful faces. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts. Warriors nodded acknowledgment, and elders approached with expressions of genuine gratitude. Chief Running Bear himself came forward to greet them, a tall, imposing figure whose presence commanded immediate respect. But when he looked at his grandfather, tears filled his eyes, and Jake witnessed something he'd never seen before, a powerful war chief showing open emotion and gratitude. Through White Eagle's translation, Chief Running Bear expressed his thanks to Jake, but the cowboy could sense there was more to come. The chief spoke at length with his grandfather, their conversation growing more intense as the minutes. Finally, White Eagle turned to Jake with an expression of profound seriousness. "My grandson wants to know if you would stay the night," White Eagle explained. "There are things he wishes to discuss. Things that concern not just our people, but all who live in this territory." Jake agreed, fascinated by this opportunity to witness a world that few white men had ever seen from the inside. That evening, he sat around a council fire as White Eagle addressed the gathered tribal leaders, sharing his vision of a future where cooperation might replace conflict. The elders spoke of the changing time, of the need to adapt without losing their essential identity, and of the importance of finding allies among the newcomers who showed respect for the land and its original inhabitants. His words carried the weight, and Jake found himself moved by the elders' wisdom. But the most significant moment came when White Eagle publicly acknowledged Jake's kindness, describing how the cowboy had risked potential danger to help a stranger in need. The elder's words transformed Jake from an outsider into something unprecedented, a white man who had earned the respect and gratitude of an entire tribal community. Chief Running Bear stood and spoke directly to Jake, his words translated by White Eagle. "My grandson says that you have shown the kind of character his grandfather always told him to look for in people, regardless of their appearance or origin. He says that your actions have saved not just one life, but potentially many lives, because his grandfather's counseled conflict destroyed both our..." The chief continued, explaining that Jake's kindness had demonstrated something that many in both communities had begun to doubt, that understanding and cooperation were still possible between their peoples. White Eagle's safe return meant that his voice would continue to advocate for peaceful solutions to the growing tension in the territory. That night, Jake slept in a guest lodge, his mind reeling from everything he'd experienced. He'd set out to help one sick old man and found himself at the center of something much larger than he'd ever imagined. The next morning brought the moment that would become legend throughout the territory. As Jake prepared to return to his ranch, Chief Running Bear made an announcement that would forever. Through White Eagle's translation, the chief declared that Jake Morrison was now under the permanent protection of the Crow Nation. "Any who would harm you," the chief proclaimed, "harm us all. Any who would threaten your property, threaten ours. You have shown honor to our grandfather, and we will show honor to you." Jake thanked them for their kindness, but he didn't fully understand the magnitude of what had just occurred until he returned to his ranch. As he crested the final hill before his property, he stopped his horse in amazement at what he saw below. Surrounding his modest barn and house, positioned at respectful distances, clearly visible, were hundreds of Crow warriors. They sat their horses with quiet dignity, their presence unmistakable but non-threatening. As the morning sun climbed higher, Jake counted them, nearly 300 mounted warriors, all facing outward from his property, forming a protective perimeter that stretched as far as the eye could see. Word of the unprecedented display spread through the territory like wildfire. Neighbors who had been planning to pressure Jake to sell his land suddenly found themselves reconsidering their approaches. Outlaws who had been eyeing his cattle for potential rustling operation quietly moved on to easier targets. Even the territorial authorities took notice, realizing that this cowboy had somehow achieved something that years of negotiation and conflict had failed to accomplish. The protection wasn't just symbolic. Over the following weeks, Jake discovered that his property had become the safest place in the entire territory. His cattle were never bothered by rustlers, his crops grew unmolested, and travelers began to seek him out, knowing that his ranch represented a neutral ground where conflict were set aside. But the true reward came in the relationship that developed. White Eagle began visiting regularly, sharing his knowledge of the land and its season with Jake. The elderly medicine man taught the cowboy about which plants could heal wounds, which weather signs predicted storms, and which parts of the territory held special significance for his people. Through these visits, Jake learned that his act of kindness had indeed prevented the larger conflict that White Eagle had feared. The elders' council at the tribal gathering had convinced several war chiefs to pursue diplomatic solutions rather than armed resistance to the increasing settler presence. Lives had been saved on both sides because one cowboy had chosen compassion over indifference. Chief Running Bear also became a regular visitor, offering small gifts of gratitude, sharing news from throughout the territory. Through these conversations, Jake gained insights into the complex political and cultural challenges facing the native peoples, and he began to understand his own role as an unofficial ambassador between the two communities. The friendship that developed between Jake and White Eagle became the foundation for something unprecedented in the territory, a genuine understanding between representatives of two cultures that had been taught to view each other as enemies. Their relationship proved that respect and cooperation were possible when people chose to see beyond surface differences to the common humanity beneath. As autumn arrived, Jake realized that his life had been fundamentally transformed by his decision to help one old man beside a cottonwood tree. His ranch had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose kindness over fear, understanding over prejudice. The protection of the Crow warriors remained, but it had evolved into something more significant, a living example of how different peoples could coexist and even support each other. White Eagle's health continued to improve under Doc Henderson's care, supplemented by his own traditional medicine. The elder lived to see several more seasons, during which he continued to serve as a voice of wisdom and moderation in an increasingly complex world. His influence helped establish several successful peaceful agreements between tribal communities and settler groups throughout the region. Jake's story spread far beyond Montana territory, becoming a legend that was retold around campfires and in frontier newspapers. People came from hundreds of miles away just to see the ranch where 300 warriors had stood guard, drawn by the proof that understanding between different peoples was not only possible, but could flourish when built on genuine respect and kindness. The morning when the warriors first surrounded Jake's property became known throughout the territory as the Dawn of Honor, a moment that demonstrated the power of individual actions to create change far beyond their immediate scope. Jake had helped one man, but in doing so, he had helped heal a divide that many had thought unbridgeable. Years later, when settlers and historians looked back on this period of Western expansion, Jake Morrison's name was always mentioned as an example of how the frontier could have developed differently. His story proved that the conflicts between settlers and native peoples weren't inevitable, that there had always been opportunities for understanding and cooperation for those willing to seek them. The protection of the Crow Nation remained with Jake throughout his life, but more importantly, the friendship and understanding he'd gained proved that the greatest rewards often come not from grand gestures or heroic deeds, but from simple acts of human kindness performed when no one is watching and no reward is expected. White Eagle lived long enough to see his vision of cooperation begin to take root throughout the territory. Before he passed peacefully in his sleep several years later, he told Jake that saving his life beside that cottonwood tree had been the catalyst for changes that would echo through generations. You showed my people that not all who came to our lands as enemies, and you showed your people we were not the savage of fear. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from the courage to extend your hand. The barn that 300 warriors had guarded still weathered by prairie storms, but enduring as a extraordinary moment when prejudice and fear was overcome and when one man's simple kindness created ripples changed. Jake Morrison had started that fateful morning as just another cowboy trying to make a living on the frontier. By sunset, he had become something much more significant, a bridge between worlds, a symbol of what America could become when its people chose to honor the dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of their background or appearance. The story of the cowboy who took a native elder to his doctor and found himself protected by 300 warriors at sunrise became more than just a frontier legend. It became a reminder that in a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, the simple act of helping someone in need can create miracles that no amount of force or politics could ever achieve. The true test of this newfound protection came 6 months after that legendary sunrise, when a group of cattle rustlers, led by a notorious outlaw named Black Jack Sullivan, decided to challenge what they saw as an impossible arrangement. Sullivan had heard the stories about Jake's protection, but dismissed them as frontier tall tales, convinced that no group of native warriors would actually risk conflict with white outlaws over one cowboy's cattle. Sullivan and his gang of 12 hardened criminals arrived at Jake's ranch on a cold February morning, planning to steal his entire herd in broad daylight. What they encountered instead became another legend that spread throughout the territory faster than a prairie fire. As Sullivan's men began to round up Jake's cattle, the morning mist seemed to come alive around them. Silent figures materialized from the landscape itself, as if the very earth had given birth to armed warriors. Within minutes, the rustlers found themselves completely surrounded by more than 50 Crow fighters, their horses stepping carefully through the snow, their weapons ready, but not yet raised. Chief Running Bear himself appeared, riding a magnificent black stallion, his presence commanding immediate attention. He spoke no English to the outlaws, but his message was unmistakably clear. Through a young warrior who served as translator, the chief delivered an ultimatum that would be repeated in saloons and trading posts for years to come. "You have entered protected lands," the translator announced, his voice carrying across the frozen prairie. "The man who lives here has earned the honor of our people. You will leave now with your lives, or you will stay forever without them." Black Jack Sullivan, despite his reputation for fearlessness, found himself facing a situation unlike any he'd encountered in 20 years of criminal activity. The warriors weren't threatening or aggressive. They were simply present, like a force of nature that couldn't be argued with or intimidated. The mathematical reality was undeniable. 12 outlaws against 50 seasoned warriors was not it was a conclusion already written. Jake emerged from his house during this tense standoff, carrying only a cup of coffee and wearing no weapon. He walked calmly to where Sullivan sat his horse, steam rising from the hot coffee in the cold morning air. "I reckon you boys are lost," Jake said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than addressing a gang of armed thieves. "The nearest settlement is about 15 miles that way," he pointed out, "and I'd suggest you head there before this coffee gets cold." The simplicity of Jake's words, combined with the silent presence of the warriors, created a moment of such surreal calm that even the hardened outlaws seemed mesmerized. Sullivan stared at Jake for a long moment, perhaps trying to understand how one man could stand so peacefully in the middle of what should have been a dangerous confrontation. "You the one they call the bridge builder?" Sullivan finally, his voice lacking its usual. "I'm just a rancher who helped a sick old man," Jake replied, "but these folks seem to think that means something." Sullivan looked around at the circle of warriors, then back at Jake. Something in the cowboy's quiet dignity seemed to affect even his criminal sensibilities. Without another word, Sullivan wheeled his horse around and led his gang away from the ranch, leaving behind what might have been the only cattle they'd ever encountered that they didn't try to steal. Chief Running Bear approached Jake after the outlaws disappeared over the horizon. Through his translator, he explained that word of this confrontation would spread throughout the criminal network that operated in the territory. Jake's protection was now proven, not just proclaimed. My grandfather, White Eagle, says that today proves the power of earned respect. These men came expecting to fight a cowboy, but instead they encountered the honor of a nation. The incident with Blackjack Sullivan's gang marked a turning point in how Jake's story was perceived throughout the territory. What had begun as an inspiring tale of cross-cultural friendship now became a practical lesson in the power of genuine alliance. Jake's ranch wasn't just protected by sentiment, it was defended by one of the most formidable fighting forces in the region. This protection extended beyond Jake's immediate property in ways that surprised even him. When neighboring rancher Tom Bradley found his cattle being rustled, he rode to Jake's ranch asking for advice. Jake suggested that Bradley accompany him to speak with Chief Running Bear, beginning a relationship that would eventually extend similar protection to several other locals who demonstrated respect for crow territory and custom. White Eagle's influence in expanding relationships cannot be overstated. The elder served as both mediator and teacher, helping Jake understand the complex protocols of Crow society while explaining to his own people the pressures and challenges facing the white settlers. His wisdom prevented countless misunderstandings that could have erupted into conflict. One particularly significant example occurred when territorial surveyors arrived to map the region for potential railroad development. Their initial surveys showed routes that would have crossed sacred Crow burial ground, a discovery that could have led to violent confrontation. White Eagle brought this information to Jake, who arranged a meeting between the survey team and tribal representatives at his ranch. The negotiation that followed, conducted in Jake's barn under the same roof that had been guarded by 300 warriors, resulted in a route modification that preserved the sacred sites while still allowing for railroad development. The compromise became a model for similar negotiations throughout the West, proving that economic development and cultural preservation could coexist when mediated by people of good faith. Jake's role in these negotiations established him as an unofficial diplomat, someone trusted by both communities to represent their interests fairly. This responsibility sometimes weighed heavily on him, especially when the issues involved life and death decisions rather than simple boundary disputes. Such a case arose when an outbreak of smallpox threatened both the Crow community and the growing settlement of Billings. Doc Henderson had limited vaccine supply, and tensions arose over how the medicine should be distributed. Some settlers argued that the native population should wait until all white families were protected, while some tribal members suggested that the newcomers had brought the disease and should face its consequences alone. White Eagle and Jake worked together to address this crisis, organizing a distribution system based on vulnerability rather than race. Children and elders from both communities received priority, regardless of their background. Jake personally rode between communities, coordinating the medical response and ensuring that fear and prejudice didn't interfere with life-saving treatment. The success of this medical cooperation saved dozens of lives and further cemented Jake's reputation as someone who could bridge the gap between communities in time of crisis. More importantly, it demonstrated to both groups that their survival was interconnected, that disease and disaster recognized no cultural boundary. As Jake's influence grew, so did the scope of his responsibility. He found himself mediating disputes not just between settlers and the Crow Nation, but between different tribal groups, between ranchers and farmers, and even between competing business interests in the growing territorial economy. White Eagle often reminded Jake that his unique position came with both power and danger. You walk between worlds during their evening conversation. This makes you valuable, but it also makes you a threat to those who profit from division and this warning proved prophetic when territorial politicians attempted to use Jake's influence for their own purpose. A group of land speculators approached him with offers of substantial payment if he would help them negotiate mineral rights on Crow territory. When Jake refused, they attempted to pressure him through threats and economic manipulation. The speculators' campaign against Jake included spreading rumors about his loyalty, questioning his patriotism and even attempting to have him investigated by territorial authorities as a possible spy or traitor. These attacks might have destroyed any other settler, but Jake's reputation for integrity and his protection by the Crow Nation made him essentially untouchable. Chief Running Bear's response to these attacks was swift and unambiguous. He publicly declared that any attempt to harm Jake Morrison through legal, economic, or physical means would be considered an act of war against the Crow Nation. The territorial governor, already struggling with multiple conflicts throughout the region, quickly made it clear to the speculators that their campaign against Jake was unwelcome and counterproductive. White Eagle used this incident as a teaching moment, helping Jake understand the broader political forces at work in the territory. The elder explained how economic interests often drove conflicts between peoples and how Jake's example of cooperation threatened those who profited from division and hostility. "You have shown that our peoples can work together, White Eagle. This is dangerous to those who make money from our fighting. They will always try to destroy bridges between communities because bridges threaten their profits." This education in territorial politics helped Jake navigate the increasingly complex landscape of Western expansion. He learned to recognize the difference between genuine conflicts of interest and manufactured disputes designed to benefit outside agitators. His ability to identify and diffuse artificial tensions became one of his most valuable skills as an unofficial diplomat. The lasting impact of Jake's story extended far beyond the immediate territory. Newspaper accounts of the cowboy protected by native warriors reached eastern cities, where they influenced public opinion about Western expansion and Indian policy. Writers and journalists began to seek out Jake for interviews, drawn by this proof that cooperation between settlers and native peoples was not only possible, but beneficial to all involved. One such journalist, writing for Harper's Weekly, spent a week at Jake's ranch documenting the daily interactions between the cowboy and his Crow allies. The resulting article, titled "The Bridge Builder of Montana," reached hundreds of thousands of readers and helped shift national conversation about frontier relationships from one focused on inevitable conflict to one that considered the possibilities of mutual respect and cooperation. White Eagle lived to see these broader impacts of their friendship, taking particular pride in knowing that their example had influenced policy discussions in the nation's capital. In one of their final conversations, the elder reflected on how a simple act of kindness beside a cottonwood tree had grown into something that affected the lives of people they would never meet. "The spirits work in ways we cannot all." His aged hands gestured toward the where the sunset painted. "They guided you to find me, not just to save one old, but to save an idea. The idea that different people can choose under awesome." And in the years that followed, whenever travelers passed by Jake Morrison, the weathered barn, standing proud against the sky, they remembered that this was the place where hatred had been overcome by kindness, where prejudice had given way to respect, and where one man's had proven that the human heart, when open to others, could indeed change the world.